Sitting, and I have to figure out if I have a friend or not.
Oh, nice. How are you?
Nice to see you.
It's been a while.
I know. It's been a while. How's everything?
Everything is good.
You guys are like...
We're doing live.
That's great. Good.
Alright.
Okay, we'll see you.
Oh, no, I'll see you. Bye.
Thank you.
Are these available? ቦታ አለ? ቦታ አለ?
That's the opening. Yeah, telephone lines, travel, orders.
እዚህ ጋር አለ ቦታ
was looking through, I was like, well, this is where I wrote, this is changed like every other word. Versus like,
I've actually gone all the way down through the smile. I've been to all of basically, then so you can tell it would be, I haven't been back for a long time. It was dangerous to go in there. No, I didn't, but my sense is one of the things that does make some of these resources ask them what was clear. And still they
twice in 1 week. Too much.
But it would actually somebody sit there and so it's the crowd you see.
Well, good morning, everybody. Sorry for the delay in getting started this morning. Good afternoon and welcome to the U.S. Institute of Peace for our continuing series, Changing Ethiopia. You can also follow the discussion online with that hashtag. My name is Ali Bergi and I'm a senior advisor to the Africa program here at the Institute. We've had a few small changes this morning, for which I apologize. Unfortunately, as a victim of the strong winds across the Atlantic, our two speakers coming in from Ethiopia are not yet here. They're at Dulles and they're on their way, but we're going to start the conversation with the speakers that we do have and integrate them when they arrive. A few words of introduction about the Institute before we turn to today's panel for the benefit of those of you who haven't been here before, as well as our audience online. The U.S. Institute of Peace is a national, non-partisan, independent institute founded by the U.S. Congress in 1984 and dedicated to the proposition that a world without violent conflict is possible, practical, and essential for U.S. and global security. And today we're delighted to host a discussion about one of those countries pivotal to global security, particularly in the Horn of Africa, Ethiopia, to discuss in particular the philosophy and the ideas that have emerged from Ethiopia's still relatively new Prime Minister, Dr. Abiy Ahmed, this most recent recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize. Medemer, this is the name of this philosophy. But what is Medemer? What does it mean? What does it not mean as well, perhaps? What are its principles? And what are their implications both for Ethiopia and beyond? Is it a new idea? Is it a path to sustained reform, or merely a catchy slogan? To discuss some of these questions, as well as the broader bilateral relationship between the US and Ethiopia, I'm joined today by a couple of eminent panelists, and I'll introduce who we do have at the moment and come back to our later guests when they arrive. Itana Dinka, our discussant today to offer some critical reflections, is visiting assistant professor of African history and Mellon postdoctoral fellow at Oberlin College in Ohio. He is the author of Society, Revolution, and Military Intervention in Ethiopian Politics, Experiences Among the Maka Oromo of Walaga from 1974 to 1991. And his research interests include the political history of Ethiopia and the Horn of Africa. We also have, as our DC representative here, Ethiopia's ambassador to the United States, who will make some opening remarks, and then we'll kick off the conversation, who has been ambassador now just for 9 months, he was telling me. Previously, he served as Director General of the Ethiopian Investment Commission, head of the Addis Ababa Investment Agency, and as Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed's first Chief of Staff from April to December 2018. So please join me in welcoming our panelists and Ambassador for opening remarks.
Thank you. Good morning. I'm checking if there are people in the room. Good morning. Good morning. Thank you. Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I'm very honored to be here with you this morning among this August Assembly. Before I start my remarks, I would like to express my sincere appreciation to the U.S. Peace Institute for organizing this timely event to discuss Medemer, the new philosophy introduced by Ethiopian Prime Minister and Nobel Peace Laureate Dr. Abiy Ahmed. Thank you very much. As most of you know, immediately after taking office in April 2018, Prime Minister Abiy initiated unprecedented political and economic reform measures that have completely changed Ethiopia's political landscape and put our country on a new trajectory of social and economic transformation. His achievements have been duly recognized not only at home but also internationally, with the honor of receiving the 2019 Nobel Peace Prize. Some of the major reforms undertaken in the past few months include the following. Immediately after taking office, the new administration lifted the country's state of emergency and released thousands of political prisoners. The terrorist designation of exiled opposition political groups was removed, and they were invited to return home to participate in the political process. Media censorship was discontinued, and several repressive laws have been revised to build a more transparent, accountable, and democratic governance. Ethiopia now has a gender-balanced cabinet, a female president, and Supreme Court Chief Justice, among other high-level appointments, significantly increasing the influence of women in the country's political and public life. The Prime Minister took the courageous initiative to resolve the border conflict with Eritrea, ending the 20-year no war, no peace stalemate between the two countries. Furthermore, his effective mediation of conflicts between Eritrea and Djibouti, between Kenya and Somalia, as well as in Sudan, South Sudan, and beyond, inspired a new hope of stabilizing and integrating the Horn of Africa and the continent at large. In the economic front, the government has introduced a series of reforms to open up and transform the economy from state-driven development towards greater participation of the private sector. Accordingly, the government has initiated an ambitious homegrown economic reform program with the aim of ensuring rapid economic growth, generating employment opportunities, especially for the youth and women, and creating an inclusive pathway to prosperity for all. A national ease of doing business initiative is being implemented with the aim of improving the business climate, eliminating bureaucratic red tape, and creating a predictable and transparent regulatory framework. A new investment proclamation is recently approved by the Parliament to modernize the investment regulatory framework and encourage private sector participation and foreign investment in several sectors of the economy. Ladies and gentlemen, getting back to the main theme of today's forum, Understanding Medemer, the organizers ponder whether this new political philosophy can remake Ethiopia, and they framed three important questions for discussion. One, what are the key principles of Medemer and how can they be applied both domestically and abroad? Two, how does Medemer link with existing Ethiopian political and social structure? And three, is Medemer a path to sustained reform or merely a political slogan? As this question will be addressed by a distinguished panel of experts, including senior advisors from the Office of the Prime Minister, I will not dwell on the details here. However, I will try to highlight some of the core aspects of Medemer to provide a general framework for our discussion. In explaining the philosophy of Medemer during his Nobel Peace Prize acceptance speech, Prime Minister Abiy has noted that Medemer is a homegrown idea that is reflected in our political, social and economic life. It signifies synergy, convergence and teamwork for a common destiny. The Prime Minister envisioned Medemer as a social compact for Ethiopians to build a just, democratic and humane society by pulling together our resources for our collective survival and prosperity. He said at its core, Medemer is a covenant of peace that seeks unity in our common humanity. It pursues peace by practicing the value of love, forgiveness and reconciliation. Beyond the broader Ethiopia's Medemer inspired foreign policy pursues peace through bilateral and multilateral cooperation and good neighborhoodness. The inclusiveness of Medemer ensures no one is left behind, and we strive to live with our neighbors in peace and harmony. To further elaborate the concept, I would like to share with you some insightful reviews by a prominent scholar here in the US, Professor Almara, who has written extensively on Medemer over the past months. In his recent Medemer book review, Professor Almara wrote, "In the dynamic process of cooperation and competition, Medemer represents a synergetic process of coming together of individuals, groups, leaders, and institutions to work more energetically and effectively for the common good in the public interest. That synergy, using a physics metaphor, would be like fusion in which nuclei combine to release vast amount of energy. When individuals, groups, institutions, etc. coming together in Medemer form, they release a vast amount of social, political, and economic synergy. This Medemer, as synergetic collaboration for the task of nation building and collaborative progress, aims to harness the aspiration of individuals and unleash their energies for the collective good. Thus, from the above brief review, we can understand that Medemer is not just a political philosophy or a mere political slogan. It's rather a grand vision that encompasses the political, cultural, economic and social fabrics of the society. Although we still have a long way to go, the achievements gained so far by the political and economic reform undertaken within a short period of time are both exceptional and are commendable by any standard. We understand that these deep-rooted reform measures take time and require patience. We also recognize that the journey will not be smooth and there will be bumps in the road that will challenge us to derail the reforms. As we have already started the preparations to hold the general election in a few months, the challenge ahead of us could be even more daunting. However, the Ethiopian government is fully committed to stay the course and ensure that the upcoming election is free, fair, and transparent. Let me conclude by emphasizing that in order to ensure that the reform measures are sustained, they require the participation of all stakeholders, political parties, civil society organizations, and the public at large, each and every one of us. I'm confident that all of us make positive contributions towards the peace building and democratization process in the spirit of Medemer. The political and economic reforms will create new opportunities for Ethiopian people to build a democratic, peaceful, and prosperous society. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador, for your remarks, and thank you for joining us today. Maybe we can start where you left off, just to begin the conversation and come back to Medemer in a moment. But you talked about reforms. And for those of us who've been watching Ethiopia since Prime Minister Abiy came into power and witnessing the changes, observing the many accomplishments that have occurred in a fairly short period of time, one question that I have for you is to hear a little bit more about what reforms do you feel are most important now? When we talk about reforms, and you talked about political reforms, economic reforms, you could also mention security reforms. The danger is that it's a seemingly endless list. And I think it would be useful and interesting for us to try and understand more about what the priorities are. If we talk about now, early 2020, you mentioned the elections are upcoming later this year. What are the reforms that are both necessary now in 2020, achievable now, realistic now, and what are the priorities for the government when we talk about reform? What does this mean, practically speaking?
Thank you. The whole concept of reform is why the reform was needed. Before Prime Minister Abiy came to power, as most of you remember, there were large number of youths needing a reform, pushing for change, and that built up over a long period of years. And basically, if you see what happened before the Prime Minister Abiy came to power, there were, in terms of economic progress, there were fast growth, mainly fueled by public investment in infrastructure, and mainly by state-owned enterprises. Banks were not providing any resources or enough resources for the private sector, and the private sector in every sector were not able to compete easily with government or state-owned enterprises. So because of that, there were feelings of non-inclusive approach for economic, as well as when you come to the political process, the parliament that is still working at the moment is 100% controlled by the governing party, which has created a sense of alienation, or people want to be inclusive. So the reform is both political, economic, has been the need for inclusiveness.
Sure, but what are the priorities? Because when you mention the parliament, yes, you're right, it is, as you say, 100% held by the governing party. That isn't going to change tomorrow. That may change with elections whenever those are held. But what are the priorities that the government can do now? You can't change the composition of the parliament, right? That's going to remain more or less unchanged. So when you talk about economic reforms, for example, what are the things that the government can do in the near term?
Okay, as I explained earlier on my opening remark, I'll come to the economic part, but in the economy and the political part, to allow citizens to participate directly or through whomever they are represented by opposition parties, to express their views, to allow freedom of speech and also freedoms of expression, which is already on the constitution but was not practiced. So there were also laws that prevented practically the expression that was enshrined in the constitution. So removing, changing, and enacting new ones has been a priority, and that has been already done and will continue to be. So that's part of the democratization process, political process.
So if I can ask you on
yeah,
this, then what, because as you said, it has been done. I mean, opposition parties are now able to function. There is greater freedom of expression, media, and so on. So what remains to be done? What still can be done now?
So that is just opening up. One of the problems, as I said, was lack of inclusiveness. And the political parties that dissent, that has different views, some of them were labeled as terrorists, exiled or imprisoned, some of them left for life or death sentence. All were given amnesty, all were given another chance to not only be free but also participate in a political process in that they are now participating. So that part has been already done. And with the remaining periods, there are things that will be done in consultation with the participants in the political process. In the economic sphere, the main or the core for the reform has been homegrown economic reform program, which is basically reviews what went wrong and found out that public has crowded in and private sector was not supported. So the theme is just to encourage private sector participation by way of, first one is not maybe the main one, but privatization, partial privatization is part of it, but the challenge is not only few public ownership, but also there are challenges in the macro arrangement where you have huge foreign currency shortages, the exchange rate control or the foreign currency policy, the trade policy, all that has to be reviewed in pursuit of supporting the private sector and accelerating the growth. So to do that, we needed to look into the areas that need change, one of which is to improve the ease of doing business. The business climate was not as supportive as it should be, especially we have two regions. One is supporting the FDI, which relatively was friendly, but still when it comes to access to land, power, or contract enforcement, or related, the ease of doing things, tax collection, and liquidation even. There were so many challenges in it. So the reform includes easing all those parameters. Import-export policy, accessing foreign currency for inputs, as well as for other purposes to run the business has been a challenge. So reducing the import-export time as well as cost so that companies operating, be it FDI or locals, be more competitive in a global sphere. That was also another area that has been touched on. Also acceding to WTO has also been considered after 8 years as part of this reform, the first meeting has been commenced 2 weeks ago. So you see, when it comes to public investment that were designated as public investment now are open to PPP for the first time. We have at the moment more than $9 billion worth public-private participation projects already identified and available for participation. Road projects, power projects, and also other areas. And when it comes to privatization, sugar industries are ready for full privatization. And Ethio Telecom, which is the biggest in terms of mobile subscription in Africa, even bigger than big operators. But when it comes to internet and digital services, one of the poorest, is also open for partial privatization in order to create efficiency and competition, and will be implemented through transparent process. We are not here to transfer the asset to a private sector and create private monopoly. Here we are trying to bring more efficiency through new technology and expanding the service in areas that are highly needed, which is access to internet. When the user gets connected to the internet, they will be liberated to connect to the rest of the world, and companies who want to do outsourcing businesses and other related to IT sectors will be highly encouraged to do that business as well. So this will open up for not only in telecom, but also power is also ready for partial privatization, and PPP is also available. All arrangements are also there. Railways, for the first time, logistics sector has been opened. Has been liberalized for private sector, and also is ready for privatization and joint venture. Thank you.
Ambassador, maybe we can come back to some of the many details you raised in a moment, particularly this idea of a homegrown reform plan, because I think a lot of us would recognize when you talk about privatization and more investments and so on, that this isn't necessarily a unique approach. It's certainly something that's happened in a lot of countries. But I want to bring Etana Dinka into the conversation first for a moment to ask you the question about reform from the vantage point of 2020 February. What reforms are necessary in Ethiopia? You've heard what the ambassador has to say in terms of both political reforms and economic reforms. What is your opinion on what Ethiopia needs in terms of reforms at the present time?
Thank you for the opportunity. Now, since every political group, every civic organization, and in fact the entire country agreed that Ethiopia got into reform, we are now in the second year. Like the ambassador enumerated earlier, peace was made with Eritrea, prisoners were released, exiled political parties went home. So all of this happened since April 2018, and no one will be able to challenge that, because it's a positive move toward this democratization process. But after 2018, as soon as the new Prime Minister Abiy came to power, Ethiopia is not doing well, and the main agenda is not about reform. The main agenda of Abiy's government is to lay the ground, build a foundation upon which Abiy will stay on power for long.
So what reforms are needed then? I mean, if you don't think reforms are occurring, what are the reforms that are needed?
The reforms needed for me are many in terms of politics, economy, and even within the society itself, including the issues of media. But the first step Ethiopia needs to do to get into a real reform, there is one priority. Unless that priority is filled, Ethiopia cannot get into a real reform, because there is a major obstacle on the way of the reform. That is the Prime Minister Abiy himself.
So what is that one thing that needs to happen? That one.
The removal of Abiy Ahmed from office.
Okay. I'm not sure I see that as a reform exactly. So I want to ask you, to press you a bit more on what is the reform that is needed. If Ethiopia is not experiencing enough reform in your view, what reforms are needed?
Thank you very much. So once we talk about this issue, if we agree that Abiy is a problem, not part of a solution, because since he came to office in the name of democratization, in the name of reform, lots of damages have been done to the country's institutions, including the defense forces and every institution that the country has. So the reform we need is to open a space equally for the opposition and for the governing party. Right now, the opposition has a freedom to work to some extent, which we cannot deny, in major urban centers. In rural Ethiopia today, hundreds of opposition supporters are getting into, being taken into prison. Citizens are slain, killed in broad daylight in the western province of the country. As I am talking right now, citizens are being dragged out of home, being killed. 3 provinces in the western part of the country are cut off from internet, from telephone. The country's national army are dragging youth from home, killing farmers on their own farms. In the southern part of the country, in Guji province, citizens are taken into prison for no reason. Totally, the political space has not been open the way it has been promised. There is no equal opportunity given to the opposition and to the governing political party. In fact, the governing political party is hijacking every government institution, every government structure to promote its own ideal, which is a return into imperial Ethiopia in disguise.
Ambassador, let's come back to you. There are some fairly serious things that were said there. But what I want to serious things that were said, if we can please allow the discussion to occur. I want to ask you, Ambassador, in terms of the political space that exists, I think you yourself accepted in your opening remarks that there are still things to be done, and that's why I asked you what you saw as the priorities now. In terms of the political space, let's begin with political parties. Is the situation one which can be improved? How can this happen in the time that remains before elections? We know that there isn't a lot of time if the calendar announced by the National Electoral Board of Ethiopia basically holds. We'll have elections in August of this year. It's just a few months away. What can be done to increase the political space, or what are the plans of the government to increase the political space for opposition parties, for other parties, particularly during an election campaign?
Thank you so much. Just to reflect on a few issues on what Itana.
Well, maybe we'll come to those in a moment, but if you could address my question, that would be great.
So, what things to be done?
On political space in particular.
Right. Okay. If I understood your question correctly, I mean, the government has been doing all its best to ensure there is peace and stability in the country. But given the previous government security apparatus, the way human rights has been was abused, and changing that with a new set of attitude and equipping that definitely will take time. So if we see, if we see the principles I just mentioned earlier, if we see the history of Ethiopia in the past 40 or more years, there were mistrust, and there were also ideas that were brought from either East, socialist attitude and principles, and from West just taking it as it is without adapting. This is the first time that we are now having a homegrown, and also what I can say is just what's exactly assessing the Ethiopian situation on the ground. So what we were lacking is, if we have to accuse each other, nobody can be clean. That's why it starts with forgiveness. As something, it looks like some religious kind of metaphor, but if we have to count, there are so many issues everyone has committed. We cannot escape from that, but we have to start afresh. So what Prime Minister Abiy is saying is that let's start fresh, no pointing fingers. We can, one can blame the other with tangible issues. So forgiveness will take us forward. Let's cooperate from now on. That's the best. So with that, if we work with that spirit, the future is in our hand. We cannot control the past. So let's work on where we are now, so that we write our own history. There are histories that are still controlling us. For example, there are identity politics, ethnic politics, religious politics. So people have to come with ideas which can convince people. What are the policies that we are bringing to people? What are we going to do to change the lives of the people? Let's discuss on ideas, not on identity. So when we do that, I think the real debate comes into picture.
Well, when you talk about forgiveness, you're touching specifically on the philosophy of Medemer, so let's perhaps go there in a moment. But I do want to ask you to respond to what Etana referenced in terms of the fact that there have been clashes. This is not something that is secret. There have been clashes in parts of Ethiopia in recent times, over the last couple of years. What, in your view, can the government do about it? What do you say to the accusation that the army or state forces have been participating or complicit in some of the violations that have occurred? What is the government's response to that?
First of all, when before this thing happened, before the change happened, it's important how it happened. It's important to see how it happened. So the former Prime Minister, Haile Mariam,
Yes.
has resigned mainly because of the pressure, the mounting pressure, and also the pressure coming from the party. So there were internal fight, external fight, and I think we have to appreciate the step he has taken in Africa. He resigned himself, despite the pressure. There were pressures. He understood that where that is going to lead, but he chose to resign. So there were two sets of thoughts as to how to continue. The first one was, despite the challenges in the previous electoral process, there was a law. There were views from political parties, opposition parties, some of whom were armed, and they thought they can influence, and they were asking for transitional government. So that was one of the options. I'm not saying that wasn't possible. The other course was to complete the term that was given by the Constitution to the previous Prime Minister, and then prepare for elections.
Right.
So after a thorough debate, I think this course has been taken. So there are people, opposing political parties, that still believe the first course of action should have been taken, and still they believe now we need to have that. So they see themselves fit into this process and want a new transitional government and reforming starting from the constitution, but we believe that that will bring mounting task which we cannot easily handle for a population of 110 million, where there are ethnic as well as religious conflicts are, you can feel it everywhere. So this is a kind of political consultation that has led us to where we are now.
Okay, thank you for that. But I don't think that entirely responds to the question of what has happened since Prime Minister Abiy has come into office, in terms of some of the violence that has occurred in the country, some of the displacement that has occurred in the country. Ethiopia has now a very high number of internally displaced persons as a result of some of these subnational conflicts. What do you say to the allegation that the government has, or the government forces or the army have participated, maybe not in all cases, but in some cases, to either participate in these violations or otherwise not prevent them from occurring? I mean, what is the government's response to that in terms of what's happening now and last year, and not necessarily when Haile Mariam was Prime Minister?
I understand. So what happened is a continuation of what was prepared and before the new Prime Minister came to power. But now, when different parties joined for a peaceful political process, all of them were not denouncing violence. Some of them continued with their way of looking forward to power. Some of them who were in neighboring countries armed, when invited, there was a condition to denounce violence and also be unarmed. They did that when they joined, but partly what you see in parts of the country is as a result of not honoring this covenant they just took before they decided to join. But I don't want to take this blame to all, but also there were also security reform that dysfunctioned some of the security that were accused because of because of I was gonna say abuses. They were in the security realm. They were important, but were not aligned to the new change. So they were very important for securing the previous arrangement, but were not helpful for the new one. Taking changes has taken some time. That was also another thing that needed adjustment. So what you hear from people is two views. On one hand, you hear there are conflicts in parts, government is putting heavy hand. In the other hand, government is not doing enough to secure peace and stability in the country. So government has been trying with the new philosophy, first teaching, then enforcing rule of law. So in the process, it's unfortunate. There are loss of life, and also so many damages. I think the opposition party, all politicians in the country, have a role to call for peace and for peaceful process.
Okay. So I just want to be clear, so that for the benefit of the audience and also for anybody that will be watching this later, you were saying that you hold at least some opposition groups somewhat responsible for some of the things that have occurred, without going into every individual issue and area, because Ethiopia is a very large and diverse country. But as the representative of your government, you're also saying that the government accepts some responsibility for some of the violations that have occurred. Is that accurate? Is that a fair summary?
So, as you can see, we are in the making of inclusiveness. So, government is trying now not to blame one party
Yes.
over the other and make it a clear line like that. But definitely, they know it themselves,
Yeah.
those who are destabilizing. And time has been given for them to come back to their mind
Sure.
and choose a better, inclusive way of working together. In the meantime, those who are in direct contact with the violation of human rights, or the perpetrators are brought to justice.
Yes.
Again, you may feel from media, and many people also would agree that the way such responsible individuals, groups has been identified and the process has been taken, the justice process is not properly communicated,
Yeah.
and people feel that this government is not protecting the people enough, and they compare this with the previous government, which has relatively stronger communication,
Yes.
and also maybe it's not inability, but as a way of encouraging inclusiveness, as a way of giving chance for individuals who are not part of this. That's the whole thing. Otherwise, I think government is trying its best with a reformed security system, with a reformed police force, and justice reform to ensure peace and stability.
Okay. So just to be clear, again, you are saying that you do accept to some extent, not necessarily that we need to debate to what extent, but to some extent, there is also a responsibility for the government to perform better, to address some of its weaknesses, some of the violations that its forces may have occurred. Is that right? Okay. I'm glad that we're clear on that. Okay. Great. Well, just on that moment, as I was about to move on to Medemer, we have our two other guests who will be joining us in a moment. And while they just get ready, let me just ask you one more question before we turn to them. It's coming back to the economy. You mentioned, and we've heard this phrase, and the Prime Minister has also used this phrase, homegrown reform, homegrown economic reform plan. What exactly about this plan is homegrown? What is the uniquely Ethiopian element of this? Because I heard you talk about increased investment, I heard you talk about privatization and giving more room to the private sector. I mean, these are all things that economists all over the world encourage or discourage, depending on their own views. I don't hear that as a uniquely Ethiopian thing to do. So what are the elements of this plan that are homegrown?
The fact it makes it homegrown is that it starts from what's exactly happened in the country. So, given Ethiopia is an agrarian country, wants to pursue industrialization and has opportunities in the tourism mining sector, we want to use our opportunity by bringing more investment and enabling. So, what it makes it homegrown is it identifies the growth challenges, we call it growth diagnostics, has been done. So we are not bringing new just ideas from somewhere and trying to, in the past there were attempts to just copy from, we hear it sometimes from South Korea, developmental state approach, or from other countries. So this time what we have done is, what are the challenges in the country? Then review all those challenges. We found out the growth was double-digit for nearly 2 decades before the change. But that growth was fueled mainly because of public investment. So that is not sustainable. And too much borrowing from overseas. So we need to, based on our resources, to sustainable development, which is unlocking opportunities and also support the private sector.
So what it sounds like to me is that you're describing a plan that is tailored to Ethiopia's circumstances, because certainly Ethiopia is not the only country in the world that has a primarily agrarian or agricultural economy. It's certainly not the only country that wants to diversify and industrialize. What I'm hearing you say is that the plan, whatever the economic plan is, needs to be tailored to the particular circumstances and realities of Ethiopia. But in terms of the responses, whether it's privatization of, you mentioned the industries, you mentioned the opening, whether it's transport or telecoms or what have you, that it sounds to me like the solutions to that are from amongst the ones that we might recognize in other countries, but that they may not have been pursued in Ethiopia before. Is that fair?
Just to give you one simple answer maybe for that, if you remember the structural adjustment programs that were taken in the 80s and after that, mainly in Africa and after Cold War, in the East Bloc, the Eastern Bloc, most of them were driven by IMF and World Bank. If you do this, we'll give you this. But what happened in Ethiopia is just, this is our plan. Anyone, multilateral or bilateral, could you support us? So totally different from what has been achieved. So in the case of structural adjustment, after they failed, blamed the financial institutions. Here now, we are saying it's our plan and we know how to do it. So just review what we have planned, and also if you believe in it, join us. We are now on the way to prosperity.
Well, thank you, Ambassador, for holding the fort in the absence of your colleagues. Perhaps we can ask your two colleagues to join us on stage, and I'll briefly introduce them, so please come up if you can. Well, thank you. Welcome. I know that traffic is still what it is. Dulles is not that close, but thank you for making the journey, the long, long journey from Addis. We've been talking, in your absence, a little bit about the ambassador's experience. Of course, you know very well that he was also working in the Prime Minister's office for some time, and we were just talking a little bit about his own views and some of what he said in his speech. But perhaps we can turn now more to Medemer as the philosophy, which we try to stay away from a little bit, although the ambassador said, and we've just been talking about forgiveness, and forgiveness is obviously one of these key concepts in Medemer. So let me just say a few words of introduction and then put questions to you immediately. Lenco Bati is the Senior Political Diplomacy and Foreign Policy Advisor in the Office of Prime Minister Abiy. Prior to returning to Ethiopia to join the Abiy administration, Mr. Bati taught human and political geography at Gustavus Adolphus College in Minnesota. So welcome back to the US. And we also have sitting to your left, Mama Miretu, who is Senior Advisor on Policy Reforms and Chief Trade Negotiator in the Office of the Prime Minister, and you lead the policy and performance team as well in the Office of the Prime Minister. So thank you, gentlemen, again for coming and for making it here. Lenco Bati, if I can turn to you. We've heard...
Sorry for interruption, but because Ambassador was talking for most of the time, I have just one point before we get into the main discussion of the Medemer.
Can I come back to you in just a moment? Can I just put a question to our...
Just to be fair to the audience.
Yeah, sure, don't worry. We'll get there. So, Mr. Bati, if I could come to you and just ask you, what does Medemer mean for you? What you may have not heard is that the ambassador summarized and gave some of the excerpts of the speech that the Prime Minister gave in Oslo when he received the Nobel Prize. But can you explain to us, when we hear this word, Medemer, people say synergy, what does that really mean, like practically speaking? Synergy is one of those words that people like to throw around. It's one of those buzzwords that, you know, we can find it in a lot of places in this town, for example. What does it really mean? What does it practically mean? Can you help us try and understand that? And then we'll start from there, and then we'll come back to respond to some of the other issues that have been raised.
Thank you. Sorry for being late. I'm asked to explain the idea behind Medemer. As you all know, every society, every state has a unique history and a unique trajectory. In Ethiopian case, or in African case, in post-colonial Africa, different form of state building, different form of organizing the society has been tried. By and large, there's some success, but when we look at the continent, by and large, still we're struggling with the idea of stateless. We are struggling with the idea of how to hold the society together. In case of Ethiopia, for many, many years, a project that was aimed at creating a national political polity has been tried for many years under different governance, during the monarchy, during the Marxist regime, under Marxist-Leninist, different form of ideology has been tried. Since 1991, the federal arrangement has been tried. All of them, we cannot say they are a failure, but there are some successes, but they still remain inadequate. Ethiopia being one of the oldest nations in Africa, still from time to time it faces the challenge of stateless, it faces challenges of fragmentation. So the Prime Minister trying to find a way, how can we organize the Ethiopian society? How can we organize our political economy? How can we create a national unity? Out of this, he came up with the idea of Medemer. Medemer means it's an idea of national mobilization where we put all our efforts together instead of dichotomizing things or instead of just putting things into the extreme, trying to find a common middle ground around which we all organize ourselves and build a multinational federal states. This requires mobilizing and bringing together all ethnic groups, all religious sects. At the same time, in the arena of economy also, it requires creating partnership between private and public also, and also mobilize the entire Ethiopian population. So Medemer means it's a synergy. It is a system that looks things from holistic point of view. Usually things has been defined in dichotomous way, either in the left or in the right, or with me or against me, all those kind of stuff. But this ideology, this thinking, trying to strike a balance between competition and also cooperation. How can we synthesize? How can we synchronize our social relations, and how we can also organize our economy in creating partnership between privates and public in the past. The public has been, a lot of investment has been made in public sphere, but the private investment has been somehow suppressed. This time we are trying to diminish the role of the state eventually, but still the state still intervene when it's necessary, but we are trying to invite in the private investors and foreign investors in order to put the Ethiopian economy in the right track.
Right, so Lenco, while you were away, we actually did talk quite a lot about the economy, so let me press you more on the first part. This idea of synergy, I still don't hear an answer to my question. What does it mean, practically speaking, when we talk about a synergistic approach? I mean, the way the Prime Minister put it in his speech in Oslo was, Medemer signifies synergy, convergence, and teamwork for a common destiny. Those are nice words, but I'm still not clear on what exactly they mean, practically speaking.
But Medemer has three pillars. One It's an effort to create a national unity. And second, it's an effort to make sure citizens of Ethiopia become free and enjoy freedom. And third, combine all this, we pursue the path for prosperity. In order to do that, we need to come together.
Yeah.
Okay, we need to come together, put our efforts together, and work for common goal. Our diversity is a blessing, and we have multinational federation is state.
Yeah.
It is not a system or a process of creating one monolithic national identity. It's a way of bringing everything together.
Yes.
And create a symbiosis relationship, a relationship that is mutual.
Yeah, but
And
mutual
supporting
between who exactly? Because when you talk about mutuality of
Well,
agreements,
there are different agencies here. Society is an agency, religion is an agency, the private sector is an agency, the state is an agency. All these things need to be organized and articulated properly in order to bring a desired goal. So the synergy is organizing, coordinating all of this in a synchronized way so that we can achieve our destiny of prosperity.
and who makes those decisions about articulating it? When you talk about national unity, for example, you know, we can see on this stage that we have Ethiopians, we can all identify as nationals of that country, but what does national unity practically mean? I mean, what does it mean? Does it mean changing or reinforcing certain symbols? Does it mean changing the nature of the state's political structure? I mean, what does this really mean? We talk about national unity as if it's an obvious thing, but I don't think it's so obvious. What does it really mean?
Well, national unity means a lot of things. It's the issue of geography, it's the issue of sovereignty, and the issues of also citizens' pride. So when we say national unity in any state, a nation-state building project, these are some of the things that we pursue. Some can be arranged, can be managed through governance, through bureaucracy. Some need to also have a national aspiration where people identify themselves with the geography, with the national anthem, with the history, and also common destiny. As I say, this problem of issue of Medemer in the first place came about because we have a problem. Okay, we have a fragmented society. So the Prime Minister thinks this is a means, okay, to fix this fragmentation. If you see our federation, for example, it's a step in the right direction. But this federation is not converging. It's not a process of creating a national common political polity. Rather, what you see is a divergent federation in which, in most cases, people really don't share an aspiration of one another, even under one geographic system. So it is a necessary intervention to fix some of the system that is broken.
So when you talk about the federal structure, does convergence mean abandoning that,
No,
moving away from it?
not.
I mean, what does it mean? So this is what I'm trying to understand, practically speaking, that yes, Ethiopia is a federation. You just said that's a step in the right direction, but that there isn't convergence. So help us try to understand, practically speaking, when we talk about Ethiopia as a federal country, what does convergence mean in that particular dimension? Does it mean changing somehow, tweaking somehow? I mean, what does it mean?
No, federation is, as I said, the step in the right direction. It came about because it was aimed to answer some of pre-1991 tensions, but that federation was mismanaged. It was more of a facade. It was centrally managed, so regions were not free to run their own bureaucracy, to run their own governance. So as such, it has created a lot of conflicts. It has created a lot of tension. That's actually culminated into mass protest and opposition, and eventually the system has to change. So when we say this federation needs to converge, as an Ethiopian society, as a people under one state, we have our differences. We also have things that we have in common. We need to emphasize on what we have in common rather than emphasizing what we have separately.
So how do you propose to do that if you're also pursuing more federalism? You're saying that effectively the problem was it was too centralized or it wasn't genuine. So that means or implies that there should be more federalism, there should be more decentralization or more autonomy for the regions or however you wish to to characterize it. So if there's more autonomy or more separation or more decentralization, then how do you come up with this fact that people all identify more together? Surely the opposite would happen, or potentially the opposite could happen.
Yeah, first of all, federation that is not democratic end up in catastrophe. We have seen that in Eastern Europe. The Ethiopian Federation lacks democracy. So it is necessary to interject a democratic system of governance into Ethiopian Federation, and at the same time allow people to exercise their language and culture, and also use their resources. At the same time, also unite as a national political society.
Etana, let me come to you. You're a historian of Ethiopia. You've heard this argument that's being advanced that, yes, Ethiopia is a federal structure, we need more federalism. I mean, what is your response to that? And if I could ask you to respond specifically to this issue of, you know, does Ethiopia need more federalism? And if so, what does that mean? Does that permit convergence?
Thank you very much for that question, because the ambassador was talking about this, and very honestly to that point, I am very grateful to Ambassador FItsum to have said that identity politics is not necessary for Ethiopia when the country's constitution, the existing constitution, is about multinational federalism. So when we listen to Lenco Bati, which unfortunately just arrived, the points are very much different. I think Ambassador FItsum was very, very honest in saying that the Prime Minister and his government is against identity politics. It is not necessary. He said, when he explained, he said, people must come with ideas, which means ideas which are different from mobilization as apart from identity politics. Unfortunately, Lenco Bati is insisting that Ethiopia will pursue and maintain multinational federalism. Having said this, Ethiopia adopted multinational federalism to come out of a serious problem. It's a matter of existing or disintegrating. By 1991, when it was adopted, it was not a matter of joke, or it was not even a matter of creating comfort or any luxury. It was a matter of keeping the country together, because Ethiopia has a history of national struggle, civil war, conflicts, famine, poverty, all of those things. And that came out of the road Ethiopia traveled in history. Imperial Ethiopia, the principles of Imperial Ethiopia did not accept identities of people, cultural identity, religious identity, all sorts of diversity we have in Ethiopia. Imperial Ethiopia rejected those, and that led into the birth of liberation struggles. Liberation struggle in Tigray, in Oromia, Gambela, including Eritrea. By the way, Eritrea is a product of that policy.
Just on this question of Lenco Bati saying we need more federalism, I mean, do you agree with that?
Of course, Ethiopia needs more of not just federalism, yes, multinational federalism. Okay. You know, the Prime Minister and his assistants usually want to skip this kind of a question. They say federalism, but they are not courageous enough to call about multinational federalism. What the country needs to exist and survive this problem is to maintain and promote existing multinational federalism. What Ethiopia requires to survive as a country, as a state, is more federalism, okay, not less.
All right. Let me come back to you, Lenco Bati, and you, Mama Mebetu. When we talk about Medemer, and you've described also the problems that Ethiopia has had, there's some shared historical analysis there, I think, and you're basically describing Medemer as a response to that, right? You're saying this is it's a way to respond to these things. We've heard, you know, the sort of rhetoric of Medemer in terms of coming together and adding together and so on, but I'm still struggling to understand what does it practically mean as a solution, because I've heard the diagnosis that Ethiopia is in trouble, that Ethiopia faces many challenges. What is the solution here? I mean, when you talk about Medemer as a philosophy or as a platform or as a policy to advance addressing some of these problems, what does it entail on the political front? One of the questions I put to the ambassador a bit earlier is, with elections upcoming this year, what practically can the philosophy do or lead to? What reforms can be further affected to improve that environment where, you know, there is this idea of coming together, but also we know elections are competitive and divisive. That's the nature of elections, if you have people with different points of view. So how does Medemer really address the political space in a practical sense?
Thank you. I know Ambassador FItsum will not dismiss identity politics. I know for sure. I know him only.
So on record.
Ethiopia is a diverse nation, you know, since its inception. So we have more than 80 ethnic groups. Some of us have multiple identities. We speak different languages because we speak the language of our neighbors, the kids we went to school with. So identity is there. But the issue is identity as a cultural practice, identity as a social practice, and identity as a political instrument to mobilize. There's a lot of debate around that. Probably what the ambassador is trying to say. As far as the federalism is concerned, the Prime Minister is a federalist. We believe in federal, multi-national federation. He actually struggled within the system against a facade, artificial form of federalism where one single ethnic group mastermind, even select presidents for other regional states. So accusing him or his administration for being anti-federalism, this is not true. It's very, very, very far from the truth because we know the record, we know the struggle within the EPRDF, we also know his daily livings. He's a centrist. He has to, Ethiopia need a leader like him because there are different aspirations. There are two extremes. And the Ethiopian community is highly politicized. There is a lot of cynicism. So therefore, for him, in order to maintain the unity of this country and also move it forward, he has to maintain, you know, a balance where he can bring everybody, you know, on the right direction and move the country forward. Federalism is a constitutional issue. Nobody is going to tamper with that. And I mean, anybody who really knows the reality in Ethiopia is not going to really play around with that. So federation is going to stay. The Prosperity Party, one of its key identity is maintaining multinational federation. And how it's going to be practical, Medemer believes in inclusive politics. Let me tell you, over the last 27 years, most of the politicians were in jail or either in exile. The journalists were in prison, and the political space was controlled with narrow political oligarchy. Medemer, the Prime Minister, released all political prisoners from prison, freed journalists, reformed civil society proclamation. At the same time, also allowed all oppositions, armed and non-armed, to come to the country. He liberalized the entire political space. So right now, the political space is liberalized. That's actually the first stage of reform. Many countries either fail or succeed based on how this opportunity is managed. And the way we see it now, it needs to be handled with proper care. The opposition needs to be to implement a very civil politics. We need to accommodate each other. We need to speak to each other in a very civil way because we have common history, we have common country. There are all challenges, like any other third world countries. These are challenges. So in the past, the state was the mother of all the problems. Now I can see the way we are doing our politics is becoming, I'm not blaming the society, but it is becoming a problem. So how to really fix this and move the country forward is what Medemer is trying to.
So, but what is that? Because that's still what I'm trying to understand. When we talk about the second phase of that, Yeah, the second phase of that reform.
Yeah.
Maybe Mama wants to come in on this to respond as well. Please feel free. But yes, we know people have been released. We know that the opposition parties are working. I'm still trying to understand, and I think the audience would like to also understand, when we talk about the second phase of reform, we talk about practically preparing, for a more inclusive politics, as you put it. What does that actually mean? I mean, inclusive politics is one of those phrases that also sounds nice, but in practice, what does it mean beyond the bare ability of parties to function?
Medemer is actually much richer than inclusive politics. This is what has been prescribed from somewhere else in the past. Medemer is homegrown idea. We have our differences. We can maintain our differences, but we have common needs. As human beings, we have a common needs because we have to meet our daily needs. As citizens of a country, we need to maintain our national unity. As a people, we need to get out of this poverty and move forward and achieve prosperity. These are the three things. We have been talking about poverty for many, many years. When we talk about something again, it becomes your friend. That's why we're trying to avoid the word poverty now. That's why we adopted the word prosperity. We're dreaming big.
Mama, do you want us to come in? Maybe you can try and respond to this question of, okay, it's more than inclusive politics. We understand that. It's a broader idea. You don't want to talk about poverty, fair enough. Although we all know that Ethiopia's poverty has declined over the last, in conjunction with its economic growth, but there's still a problem of poverty in the country, definitely. So what is Medemer in a practical sense? We talk about coming together, when we talk about opposition parties functioning. Is Medemer more than a slogan for the Prosperity Party?
Definitely it's more than a slogan. I think you keep asking what Medemer is again and again, but I think you can look at it in three ways, in my view. I think the first is, the literal definition of the word itself, Medemer. It means coming together, working for the same purpose, or shared purpose, working in sync. That's the literal definition of Medemer. But I think it goes beyond this literal definition of the word. I think the first thing is Medemer can be seen as a set of ideas that guides the reform process in Ethiopia right now. So if you look at, for example, the book that was authored by the Prime Minister, there's a general discussion of what Medemer is, and then it offers a set of ideas when it comes to the economy, when it comes to the direction of the politics, when it comes to Ethiopia's foreign relations. So it has a set of ideas, really good ideas, how to guide, how to shape the reform process that's currently happening. So one way of looking at it is, it's a set of really good ideas that transform the country towards prosperity. So that's one element of it. The second element of Medemer is you can see it as a framework, as a way of looking at things, as a lens through which you examine things. So essentially what Medemer says is, it's a call to the nation to extricate this dangerous habit of throwing the past and starting with a clean slate all the time. So that needs to be stopped. What Medemer says is, instead of starting afresh every time, you build on the successes and the gains of the past, number one. Number two, you identify mistakes of the past and try to correct them. And number three, try to be observant. Try to really examine the current reality and identify the problems, come up with a solution that responds to our current reality. So it's a framework of looking at things as well. So viewed through this lens, you can actually say, what will be the policy of the government when it comes to the economy? What's the policy of the government when it comes to the foreign relation? Looking at it as a framework of thinking. But ultimately, the goal of Medemer is to achieve shared prosperity for the Ethiopian people. Ultimately, the goal of Medemer is to leave a legacy of hope for the next generation. So we look at the past, instead of throwing it away, we see what lessons that we can take from that, correct past mistakes, and build a bright future for the next generation. Ultimately, that's what Medemer is all about.
Thanks very much. That's helpful. Maybe we can move on a little bit from this to talk a bit more about foreign policy. You just mentioned that time is running. The African Union Summit just happened in Addis last week. When you walked around Addis, you could see the billboard saying Medemer for a prosperous Africa. This was emblazoned on that African Union Summit billboards. What does Medemer mean when you say it's a framework for understanding action? What does it mean when we talk about foreign policy? And let's perhaps start with the region. So we're all very much aware of the achievements that have occurred. So let's not dwell on what's been done, but let's try and understand what does it mean practically speaking. So, you know, as we know right now, Ethiopia is engaged in these sensitive talks about the Nile, with Egypt, with Sudan. Without going into the details of that, obviously it's sensitive and still a negotiation that's ongoing. But can you explain for us, for example, how Medemer, when we talk about cooperation or coming together, how would that play out in this very practical and very real case where it matters, right? The outcome matters to all the countries involved. It particularly matters to Ethiopia. So what does it mean when we talk about Medemer in a regional foreign policy context? And maybe we can start with the water issues, and then perhaps we can broaden out a little bit.
I think, first of all, I mean, when it comes to the negotiation regarding GERD, this is, as you said, a very sensitive issue, and I would avoid making any comment on that particular topic.
I mean, I'm not asking you to go into details. I'm just saying in terms of the approach when we talk about it, right? I mean, the principle, if we look at the Prime Minister's speech, is cooperation, friendship, right? And that presumably goes for the neighboring countries as well, including ones which may not have the same interests as Ethiopia. So I'm just trying to understand what it means practically speaking.
So I think, absolutely. So if you look at the Medemer conception, you can actually make really strong connection about Ethiopia's foreign policy priority when it comes to Africa. Because Medemer essentially focuses on our shared humanity. It focuses on our shared objectives. So it doesn't really wish away our differences. It actually cherishes our differences. So when it comes to African continent, for example, Ethiopia wants to play a purposeful role, an active role, to actually bring together all the African nations. A very good example of this is the role that Ethiopia played in finalizing and negotiating the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. This is a clear example of past work, legacy that we inherited from our forefathers, and creating an integrated Africa would create the basis for a prosperous Africa. And Ethiopia plays a very active and a very purposeful role in that regard. As an example, the African Continental Free Trade Agreement becomes a reality when Ethiopia ratifies the agreement. Without Ethiopia, the agreement will never come to existence. It's come to existence because of what Ethiopia did. Ethiopia brought close to 100 million people to this single African market. So this is sort of a natural extension of our domestic policy. We support, we promote coming together domestically, and a natural, kind of mirror image of that would be to support further integration effort in the African region as well.
So does that mean, I'll give you in a moment, but I just want to ask this question in response to that. Does this mean that effectively it's a sort of Pan-Africanist idea? I mean, that where we've seen, in the past, whether it's Kwame Nkrumah or even Haile Selassie, articulating this sort of Pan-Africanist vision. Is that a fair way of characterizing it? Maybe, Lenco, you want to respond to that?
To just add a little bit on what Mamo said, how Medemer applies in our foreign policy activities. For example, we promote regional economic integration in the whole. The reason is Ethiopia is the heart of the Horn of Africa, and also Ethiopia shares borders. At the same time, we also share communities. There are Oromos in Ethiopia, Oromos in Kenya, there are Tigrins in Tigray, there are Tigres in Eritrea, there are Fars in Ethiopia, Fars in Djibouti, and also in Eritrea. We have Somalis in Kenya, in Ethiopia, in Somalia, Somaliland, and Djibouti. The same with Anwar, the same with Nuer. So therefore, we share geography, we also share cultural groups. So therefore, we can say our faith is interlinked. So Medemer is interlinking things. Instead of, we don't believe in particularizing things. We are trying to create a synergy for everything. We believe it will work because human beings, as Mamo said, have similar interests. Nation also can have similar interests. I don't know any nation who really wants to condemn itself to underdevelopment. everybody wants to move forward. So in this, we can pull our efforts together. We can also use our natural endowments and work for the betterment of the whole region. For Ethiopia also, it's a larger economy. It's 108 million people. It's landlocked. It is a primary economy, agricultural economy. We need ports. All these countries around us are ports. So therefore, even for our own interest, for our own economic interest, we give priority to our neighbors. We don't have any enemies. We don't start from labeling somebody or some nation as an enemy. We start everybody as a neighbor.
So what you've described in some sense is, basic political interest, right? That Ethiopia needs access to ports. Ethiopia needs to have good relations where it has shared ethnic groups and so on. Two questions. One is, isn't that always sort of what the interests have been? I mean, the ports may change and that may still change, but where is the key difference in that?
Yeah.
But if I can just add a second question to that, coming back to this idea of beyond the border regions, right? Obviously, you're right. There are these areas where through history, colonialism, the way that land was allocated, you have groups split between several different countries. But beyond that, in terms of when it's emblazoned on the African Union banner as Medemer for a prosperous Africa, what does that mean if you are, say, Nigeria? What does that mean if you are Zambia? From the perspective of Medemer and this sort of idea that it's beyond boundaries. I mean, what should those countries understand, and by extension, countries further afield as well?
Yeah. One important concept in this Medemer is it's not a zero-sum game. It believes in symmetry, means balancing. It believes in competition. At the same time, it also believes in cooperation. So this is how our foreign policy is going to be guided. We do not pursue foreign interest. It is not because it is our right. It is because we need it. For example, the Nile. The majority of the rivers comes from Ethiopia. We are not raising an issue of rights. We are raising the issue of needs. We only use what we need. It is not about we use what is ours. We don't pursue that kind of. We just use what we need because we need it. And when we do that, we also make sure others do not get hurt or others' livelihood is not affected.
What about where needs or interests conflict? I mean, Ethiopia has its needs, other countries define their needs as well.
This is all the international relation politics. We want to pursue a different one, and we believe it will work. In ideal, as you are right, it's the Pan-African sense, and we are humans of this globe, and our life shouldn't always be fueled by throat-cutting competition.
Okay. What about for the other countries on the continent? Like I said, if you're thinking about this from a further perspective, you mentioned, Mama mentioned the Continental Free Trade Agreement. So that's obviously a tangible expression of that. It incorporates or hopes to incorporate almost every country on the continent. If you are not an immediate neighbor of Ethiopia, what does the new foreign policy mean for you? What if you are, as I said, Nigeria or Zambia or the Central African Republic or you name it? I mean, what is the expectation? Is there a general orientation that we can see coming out of this that other countries should expect or should know? Whoever wants to respond to that.
I think, Medemer, essentially, as I said, if you look at Medemer's foreign policy priority in the African continent, we want to promote integration. We want to create a bigger market within the African continent. When that happens, it will benefit not just Ethiopia, but the rest of Africa, whether it is Nigeria or South Africa or Guinea or whichever country that you mentioned, will benefit from that. It's just simple economics. When you create a bigger market, you will be able to attract investment because investors will come and invest not just in one particular country, but in all countries, knowing that they can freely trade across the African continent. And this would be an important contribution for shared prosperity, not just in Ethiopia, but also in Nigeria. So what we really want to do is, the Prime Minister often talks about markets that are open to trade, and minds that are open to ideas. That's a common phrase that he often repeats in his speech. His idea is for an Ethiopian living in Addis, Congo, and work in Lagos, for example. That kind of closer integration would benefit everyone.
Yeah, sure. Please, Ambassador.
Just to add a little bit on this, what it is we are saying it's better together. It's better our way than my way or your way. So it's not just a simple concept. When you see our politicians or many people in the country, even the intellectuals, you find a kind of orthodox or conservative kind of my way kind of attitude. Staying for the last 10 months, 9 months here in the US, I've learned you compromise a lot. I think this is a wonderful wisdom to go forward. We hardly do that. So Medemer is bringing this kind of fusion, this kind of bringing a way to work together. So what you see, what we are trying to achieve in the Nile negotiation is also what can we achieve together, because it's better together again. And when you bring this into the African continent, intercontinental free trade agreement is one of them, but that's not all. We have what we call 2063 AU African Union agenda, which has many issues to bring Africa together, to create common market, to create common African, to unite Africa. So I think the African Union team and what is coming out as Medemer has more of one and same in many ways. It aligns easily to the African agenda as well. I think we have done so much in the past saying this is my way and that's how I should be pursuing. But politicians, be it opposition or government, other institutions all have to come to listen to others and see how much they can compromise for the betterment of the nation, for the betterment of the country.
So what you're describing is not only, of course, an international precept, this my way, your way, you're also describing it in a domestic context. But listening is one thing, right? We can all listen, or you can invite people to listen and exchange views and dialogue, and that's something that is obviously very important. But that doesn't necessarily mean that there is a compromise that results in it. I mean, even on this panel, there are different points of view, right? How is it more than just about dialogue or just about hearing the other people? How is it possible, particularly for those that aren't in power or don't have the benefit of being in office? It's always easier for those that do have the power and do have the stronger position to say there should be compromise. It's much more difficult when you are in a weaker position to be economist in that way. So what does it really imply at a practical level for your average Ethiopian? I mean, if we're talking about somebody today, forgetting about the high politics and whatever else is going on amongst the political parties, if you are an average Ethiopian citizen living in Ethiopia, what does this mean to you?
So, just referring to the Medemer book, unfortunately the English version is not yet until next month, will be coming out. Just referring to that, Medemer is about clearing the past through forgiveness and coming into a new term, and then to know one another, to work together. In the past 40 years or so, politicians were divided and accusing each other, and they have never been met.
What about
in
the
person?
I mean,
I'm talking about the ordinary people as well, because the politicians, they are the one, they coin ideas that divide or unite people. So those who are receptive of these ideas have never met because they believe they are in a different world. I've been, I said, in the US meeting more than 20,000 diaspora in 22 cities in just 9 months. And in many of the meetings, I met people coming to the meeting for the first time together. They met as this community or that community or the other community, not as Ethiopian community together. So whenever some ideas were raised, the other was saying, I didn't know that you think this way. So we have never met, introduce each other, work together. So I think that's a process that we should be encouraging people to know each other, what they are thinking, what they believe, and also help them to know each other and compromise to come to center, because ultimately we have to build what we call our nation.
Okay.
Yeah.
Mama Lenco, do you want to add some? Please. I want to put the same question to you, and I also want to put it to you in a moment, Etana, as well. This idea for the individual, again, you know, the political thing, diaspora is perhaps not the majority of the people we're talking about here. The 100 million Ethiopians are mostly in Ethiopia. So what is the individual consequence of the individual implication when the Prime Minister makes these rhetorical flourishes to come together and to, you know, promote this idea of oneness? What does it mean for your average person?
Thank you. Actually, it's beyond rhetoric or pledge. It's happening actually in actual practicality. I have never seen in my life that the Ethiopian Grand Palace ever open to its citizens with this magnitude and openness.
This is the palace in Addis you're talking about.
Right now, yes. There is a lot of dialogue going on between him and the opposition leaders, and among the opposition itself. He also formed a border commission, he formed a peace and reconciliation commission. There is also an Oromo and Amhara elites forum going on, because there is the two states exhibit tension. So the actual dialogue is happening. How are we going to use it? What is a test. So the opening is there. We are going to election. We want to make sure, you know, everybody get a fair, level playing field, and let the Ethiopian people decide whom they want as their leaders. So there is massive commitment from the Prime Minister and his administration in terms of making this election free and fair and democratic and credible also. That's very important, because the credibility of state and the state-society relation depends on the outcome of that election. That's where if we succeed with liberalization, we are struggling, because the field is open and the way the politics is being played, sometimes, you know, we have, you know, 70% of the Ethiopian youth population are youth, so there is challenge, but the commitment is there. So if we manage to have a free and fair elections with credible result, then we can see a positive identification of people with the state. Then we can say we can achieve, we are really transform the Ethiopian states. So two things. One, we want to transform the state. At the same time, we also want to bring democracy to the country. There is two challenges. So this election is not just a normal election. It's actually a referendum, whether to live together or not. So it's a very complicated situation, and the Prime Minister is quite aware of this. He's working very hard. He's dialoguing with all the oppositions. For example, you know, the election board is chaired by a woman who is a victim of torture, who was also a very famous political figure at one time. 50% of the cabinets are women, so the commitment is there. So it also requires, as Mamo said, how we, the Ethiopian people, play this chance in order to move our country and transit into democratic governance.
Maybe we'll just turn to Etana, just in the interest of time. I just want to ask you to respond to this idea of what does it mean for an individual. You've heard the aspirations, some of the aspirations that remain, some of the things that have been done, but if we're talking about an individual citizen, what do you hear? What's your reaction to what you've heard here? Just briefly, please.
I think you will be fair on me as well. For Lenco opening the Grand Palace for visit for ordinary citizens or urban dwellers is a reform. But I haven't reflected on Medemer itself, because what is going on in the country tells much a lot than the rhetoric of the Prime Minister and his allies about Medemer. Medemer is not something that is yet to be put in practice. It is already practiced since April 2018 when the Prime Minister came to office. What Medemer meant, we have seen through his choices. We have seen it through his decisions. We have seen through his rhetorics. We have seen it through a number of political decisions that have happened in Ethiopia. So if you give me just 2 minutes, I want to reflect on that and come to what it means for an individual or ordinary citizens
Well, let's come to the individual right away, just because we're running out of time. I want to hear this.
I haven't reflected on Medemer itself. I haven't said anything about Medemer.
Just briefly.
One, in the first place, the claim that Medemer is a philosophy is baseless. It is not a philosophy. Medemer is not a philosophy. The book itself, the Prime Minister's book, which has just been published, did not call Medemer a philosophy. I think my colleague, the ambassador and other workers of the Prime Minister have got a chance to see at least forward of the book. It says this is an idea. It is not a philosophy.
Well, that's one. That's a minor point.
It's a minor point, but we have to take it into
what is the impact for an individual? I mean, I want to get to the heart of the matter. You can critique the concept, but you've heard one articulation for what it could be for Ethiopian citizens. I want to know if you see that vision, if you agree with that, or if you see it a different way. Do you see life changing for your average person as a result of this idea?
Medemer is an old rhetoric. It's just a return of the outworn and exhausted word unity that have been used for long. It's not a new thing. We have in Ethiopia today a Prime Minister who just saw the referendum that had happened in particular place in the south, that is Sidama, and failed to recognize that the people has decided to have a separate statehood. Unfortunately, Lenco said he is a federalist. If the Prime Minister is a federalist, what is his problem with Sidama? Why we have got 69 people killed in less than a week if the Prime Minister is a federalist? If the Prime Minister is a federalist, what is a problem with reorganizing the southern nations and nationalities into separate states? So the point is, the Prime Minister is in a process of dissolving Ethiopia's multinational federalism. That is what is unfolding in Ethiopia. One basic question, why has Ethiopia experienced all of this violence since the Prime Minister came to power? A type of violence that Ethiopia has never seen in recent decades. Why have we got people evicted in hundreds of thousands after the Prime Minister came to office? A Prime Minister who is a peace laureate, a Prime Minister who is praised to be democratic, a Prime Minister who is praised to be including women into his cabinet. But why Ethiopia hasn't got a peace when we are saying the Prime Minister is a man of peace? The answer to the question is what the Prime Minister is doing to stay in power. A Prime Minister manipulating security structure, intelligence structure, administrative structure, dissolving the old systems that kept the country together, that kept people safe, in order to expand cracks, in order to create problems, expand conflicts, and declare a state of emergency, state on power. The southern nations and nationalities is under a state of emergency right now. The western provinces of Ethiopia are under a state of emergency. The parliament knows nothing about this thing. So for ordinary citizen, Medemer is a hell.
Okay. I'll give you the chance to respond to some of my moments. Because I think it's it's important that they respond. But just in I'll give you a chance in a moment. But I do want to allow, while we still have a few minutes left, we have time I think only for one question from this side and one question from this side. I'm sorry, people, but that's how it is. So let's just have a question. Please ask a question. Please be concise and please tell us who you are. So one gentleman here, please, or lady. There's a microphone just behind you there. Yeah, thank you. I'll give you the chance to respond to these comments in your response there, but I want to hear one question from here. Please.
Thank you for being here. I'm glad that you have focused on Medemer itself. In reality, for the citizens of Ethiopia right now, who are moving from conflict, crisis to crisis to crisis, since Abiy is coming, what we are sensing is a hijacked chain.
Do you have a question, sir?
Yeah.
Yeah, please.
So,
please ask your question.
How is Medemer in any way related to the millions of Oromo youths who have gone out and put their life in danger to bring about change because of land grab that is taking away their private property?
Okay, thanks.
Their private property, personal property, is taken away, usurped by government for the enrichment of the elite, and that has never stopped. It, in fact, has been expanded.
Okay, thank you. And we'll take one question here, if there is the gentleman just here.
My question is, why the government is letting those people who committed this atrocity to the people of Ethiopia? I know Medemer's principle of bringing people together, but if we see really literally, very few people are agitating the community to create this kind of atrocity everywhere. Why the government is letting these people do these things? I think that solution can be resolved with a few people coming inside and fixing this problem. Those are the people who are causing all this problem in every part of Ethiopia. 95% of the Ethiopian population is peaceful and live together and been living together for 1,000 years. I know there are problems of all the bad thing, the history and everything. That's the philosophy of Medemer, is bringing these people together so we can find a solution. And instead of staying on the blame game and continue fighting again. So why the government is letting these people do whatever they want and get out of without any problem? This is my question.
Thanks. So a few issues that have been raised, if I could ask you to respond to them. We have this idea of question that has been raised in relation to land issues and some of the grievances perhaps of the Oromo community, why the government is not doing more. But I also would like you to respond in general, if you could, as a summary remark to the critique that you've heard, that Medemer isn't delivering, isn't actually making things worse for some people, how you respond to that. We'll start with Lenco and then we'll come to Mamo thereafter.
All right. First of all, in 18, 19 months in office, what the Prime Minister have done is something that takes a minimum 10 years to do. The speed, the commitment, and the change also. We know Ethiopia was held under the previous administration for 27 years. There are a lot of people still unaccounted for, including my brother. My brother spent 10 years under the dirt. He was released. Few months again, he was detained by TPLF. His whereabouts is still not known. My mom died. Every time somebody knocked the door, my mom said, open the door, maybe he's my son. She died with that pain. This is not only a single story, it's a multiple story. We know where some of these questions, from which corner it comes from. This Prime Minister tried to be inclusive. He believed in forgiveness. There are some who are really suffering from self-imposed isolation. Okay? The opportunity is there to participate. The opportunity is there to play their role. But if really they want to do what they have been doing for the last 27 years, Ethiopian people say no. So therefore, this Prime Minister, he freed the country. Yes, the Ethiopian people freed itself, but he is a leader who can really move this country forward. So therefore, I hear from my brother that atrocities continue, human rights, but I spent more than half of my life struggling for change. I know all this. And I'm not going to put myself in a situation where if things are not promising. I see things on the ground. I returned to Ethiopia after 31 years in exile. I was a fighter too, for that matter. So there is a change on the ground. So recycling this old rhetoric from distance is not going to solve Ethiopia's problem.
Mama, if I could ask you to try and respond to some of these critiques that have been offered. I understand that we want to articulate a positive vision, but I think it's important if you could try and engage with some of the critiques that have been offered. I mean, why is the government not doing more, for example, is one important question.
I think because I don't have, I only have a few minutes, but let me just quickly say, I think this comment, this voodoo analysis that Medemer is here is just laughable. If you want to see the record of the Prime Minister, all you have to do is just read the news. This is a Prime Minister who had achieved significant reform in a very limited period of time, and the international community has recognized it. The Nobel Committee has recognized it. For me, it's just mind-blowing, that people, how far they can go to twist things for a political purpose. I think that's not right, and that doesn't have productive and purposeful discourse. But let me just say two things. I think the first thing is, yes, we acknowledge that we need to do better and more when it comes to maintaining law and order. On that point, we absolutely agree. And I'm sure soon enough we'll see some positive developments in terms of the government taking additional concrete steps to maintain law and order in Ethiopia. But as a final point on my part, because this session is about Medemer, let me just say this. Medemer focuses on our common humanity. It focuses on our shared culture and history. That's what the Medemer is all about. It sees the Ethiopians in all of us, but at the same time, it respects and cherishes our diversity. It doesn't ignore our diversity. It respects our diversity, but at the same time, it recognizes our common humanity and shared objectives. But ultimately, the path of Medemer, the framework of Medemer, and Medemer as a political vision and conception will take this country to the inevitable destiny of prosperity. And let me just say this. When we think about prosperity in Ethiopia, we have a sort of sort of wider perspective on prosperity. It's not just about economic growth. It's also about respecting the fundamental rights of the individual. So that's where the individual comes in. It's also about respecting the freedom and liberty of the individual. It's also about fostering equality. So prosperity, in the context of Medemer, should be understood broadly, not just economic growth, but respect for equality and respect for political liberty at the same time.
Thank you very much. And on that note, we will have to leave it there. I'm sorry we didn't have more time. Alas, Ethiopian Airlines flight times are not not in our control. But please join me in thanking our panelists, Lenco, Bati,
legendary.